Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. The Buddha said his teachings were all about suffering and the end of suffering. There are different kinds of suffering that we can endure as human beings. The one that's mentioned first in the list in the First Noble Truth is the existential kind of suffering: birth, sickness, old age, and death. And those are forms of suffering that are universal for all sentient beings. And short of making an end of samsara altogether, we're not going to escape those forms of suffering as long as we're in a conditioned world. But there is a lot of suffering that you could say is optional. There's a lot of suffering that human beings endure that's entirely of their own making. And there's something oddly perverse about human beings that they seem to relish their particular suffering. I'm referring in general to the suffering that comes from identification with and putting importance on, taking ownership of the aggregates, in particular the mental aggregates of perception and mental formations, roughly thought and emotion, memory. It should be obvious that a great deal of suffering, in some people it's very intense, comes entirely from their mental contents. Their mind contents is the source of a great deal of personal misery, anxiety, pain. And in the last analysis, this is quite unnecessary. It's something we do to ourselves, and we don't need to. If we are able to see the nature, the true nature of mental formations and of feelings, then we don't have to be governed by them. There's a few kind of simple rules that you can apply, and it will improve your mental well-being and the expression of your life in general. One is not to take your mental contents so seriously. Just because you've thought something or felt something doesn't mean it's significant or important or real or needs to be dealt with. And don't be so ready to believe your own mind and the tricks that it plays and the things that it throws up. Don't nurse old grievances or wallow in regrets or unhappy memories. You don't have to take those things on board. You don't have to make them significant. See them as empty, as void, as conditionally arisen, of no importance or significance. If you find yourself caught up in some mental loop, something that's gnawing at your mind sometimes it can help to develop a sense of humor about it. Well, here's this ridiculous thing again. Don't take yourself so seriously. Don't make a big drama out of every passing feeling. Another rule to live by. This may at first sound contradictory to the first one, but it's not. This rule is don't blame your mental states on other people or external circumstances. Take responsibility for your own mental states. It's true that in our life we will face difficult circumstances, challenges. Sometimes we will have to deal with people that are troublesome or acting in a unskillful or mean-hearted way. But that's their karma and their responsibility. Your reaction to it is what you have responsibility for. It's a way of avoiding seeing your own stuff, is to blame it on others. I can't help it. She makes me so angry all the time. This is not a skillful reaction. And these negative states like anger and irritation, fear, they're never helpful. There's no circumstance in which they help you to deal with a situation. If you're facing a situation with a difficult person, being angry makes you less effective. You can't deal with the situation. Sometimes you have to, establish your boundaries. But if you're doing so from a place of strength and wisdom and courage and understanding, you can do it effectively and skillfully. If you're doing it from a place of anger, then you're going to make the situation worse and you're going to suffer. One of the things that the Buddha said about anger is, if someone's angry at another person, then what do they wish for that person? They wish, oh, I wish this person would suffer. I wish he would have pain. I wish he would be in distress. And what happens when you're angry? Well, you're in pain. You suffer. You experience distress. I like to tell this story about a person who was here, a woman who was here at one time who had done training in martial art. I forget which one it was. I should remember, but I don't. Maybe it was karate. And she had gotten fairly high up. I think she had a black belt. And I was talking to her about it one time, and I was asking her about when they have bouts and contests, competitions, how does that work? And she told me, well, you have to be careful because sometimes they'll use dirty tricks. And I said, like what? And she said, they'll try and get your goat and make you angry. Because then if you're angry, you'll make mistakes. And I thought, this is really interesting. That even in the case of a combat skill, a warrior skill, anger works against you. It makes you less effective. So even more so in ordinary interactions. In one of the Vinaya books, there's a discussion about when you should admonish a fellow monk. If a monk is doing something wrong and he has to be criticized, there's a discussion about when's the right time to do it, and there's various guidelines. And one of them is if you're angry, you shouldn't say anything. You should just shut up, let it pass, and wait till you've been able to quell your anger before you speak. So anger is a mental state that always just causes suffering. There are others, like fear. Fear and anxiety is never helpful. there's a sensible reaction to danger is to try and deal with it, to escape it or eliminate it. But if you suffer from fear, you're paralyzed and you can't take effective action. And anxiety is a kind of related to fear. It's a mental state called kakucha in Pali, anxiety that seizes the mind. It takes a form, it's very tied in with mental formations, cognitive processing, because very often when you're anxious, you start running scenarios in your mind, worst case scenarios of what could happen. And this is another form of, mental being caught in a maze, a mental maze, a loop that yields nothing but suffering. One thing to always remember with anxiety is nobody's ever thought their way out of a worry. If you have anxiety about something, sometimes the impulse of the mind is to try and solve the question in your mind. And this just goes on endlessly because you spin out new variations. Well, if I do this, then that could happen. And it becomes endless. So, similarly with regret or remorse, anxiety is running the mind off into the future, causing suffering that way. Regret and remorse is running the mind back into the past and digging up old resentments or memories or regrets that you've lost something or didn't do something correct, or you're feeling guilty about something you may have done in the past. And that's not a helpful or skillful mental state at all. The past is fixed and it's gone. It's no longer present. It's no longer real. It has maybe effects into the present, but it's not in itself. It's not real. And it cannot be ever changed. So there's no value or use in continually running back and trying to change things in the past, in the mind. It's foolishness. And human beings get caught up in their mental formations and their feelings, what we call some combination of the two. We would use the terminology in modern times of emotions. And the emotions are not real, they're not valid, they're just mental formations. They're just conditionally arisen. They're not of any great importance or significance. They're not something that you need to suffer because of. If you see them in the correct light, this is just a feeling, this is just a mental formation. It's not substantial, it's not significant in any way, it's just a mental reaction. No? And it's not that you shouldn't have emotions. Obviously, we all have emotional reactions to things, but just your attitude towards them, not to take it seriously, not to make it into something very important, that is significant. Could also say that something that's worth contemplating is one of the details from Abhidhamma, that in the passages in Abhidhamma where they correlate various mental states that can occur together or not, one of the categories is to do with feeling, Vedana. There's happy feeling, Sukha Vedana, unhappy feeling, Dukkha Vedana, or in Abhidhamma terms they're called Domanassa, and neutral feeling, Adukkam Sukham, or Upekkha. So these are correlated with various mental states, and joyful feeling and neutral feeling can occur in skillful or unskillful states, but unhappy feeling only occurs associated with unskillful states. That's a very significant thing, that there's never any value, spiritual value, in feeling sad or feeling down. That's not to say you're a bad person if you feel sad or down. Sometimes people take that the wrong way. But to recognize that's not something of value. That's not helpful. Joyful feeling is interesting, that the way it works in association with karma, it's a karma intensifier. If you do something skillful, something good, kind, generous, and you do it with joy in your heart, it's more good karma for you than if you do it just neutrally. But also, if you do something mean, cruel, selfish, if you take joy in that, it makes it worse than if you just do it coolly. It's a large part of the practice in general, not just of the meditation, although it does apply there certainly, but in the life and in your whole expression of your being, is your attitude towards the aggregates. The aggregates of a human being are body, feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness. And learning to see them and understand them and not take ownership of them, not identify with them, is really the essence of the practice. There's the story of the Buddha teaching the monks. They were sitting in a park, and in the middle distance they saw some people from the village had come gathering firewood sticks and making bundles and carrying them away. And the Buddha said to the monks, "Monks, when you see those villagers taking away the firewood sticks, do you weep and beat your breast and rend your garments and cry aloud, 'Oh no, oh no, where are they taking the firewood sticks? What's happening to the firewood sticks?'" And the monks are kind of puzzled by this. Says, "No, why should we care? There's nothing to do with us." And he says, remember that attitude that you have towards the firewood sticks. That's the attitude you should have towards the body, towards feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness. So when change and alteration comes upon them, as it will, it doesn't cause you suffering. And he's talking here about the optional suffering. There is the existential suffering. And you can see the difference in these two kinds of suffering. If you have an injury, for example, you've hurt your foot or your arm or something, and it's painful. If there's a degree of pain and suffering involved in the physical distress of the body, that's existential, that's a given. Painful feeling is a reality. But then your attitude towards it and how you hold it is entirely optional. It's entirely on you. And you can try this if you have some small ache or pain. Instead of identifying, "Oh, my foot hurts," just identify it as, there is pain. There is pain here. You're not taking ownership of it. You're not claiming it. It's not my pain, it's just pain. It still doesn't become pleasant, but it becomes instantly easier to bear because you're not claiming it. You're not identifying with it. Yeah. And even more so with the mental formations. If you have unhappy thoughts or memories, or you feeling irritation or anger, don't identify with it. Notice it as an object of consciousness. So it's not I am angry, it's anger is arising. And immediately if you take that attitude towards it, it takes the juice out of it. It becomes less powerful. There's a teaching of the Buddha about the five aggregates and the way we create a self around the aggregates in 20 ways. There's five aggregates, and each one can be multiplied by 4. If you identify with, let's say, the body, you can either say, I am the body, or the body belongs to me, or I am in the body, or the body is in me. And likewise with the other aggregates. So that makes 20, 4 times 5. And those are all ways we create a self. This is different modalities of identification. So I think a good simplification of this is not me, not mine. And that's a little phrase that's very useful. You can call up when you find yourself caught. You're stuck in some mental gymnastics and the mind's suffering. Identify it as not me, not mine. As soon as you let go of it in that way, it becomes less powerful, and you allow it to dissipate and fade. In the Visuddhimagga, and I brought this on a piece of paper because I won't remember the whole thing. In the Visuddhimagga, there's a passage that talks about the proper way of seeing the aggregates. And remember, that's body, feelings, mental formations, perception, and consciousness. You should see the aggregates as impermanent, as painful, as a disease, a boil, a dart, a calamity, an affliction, as alien, as disintegrating, as a plague, a disaster, a terror, a menace, as fickle, perishable, unenduring, as no protection, no shelter, no refuge, as empty, vain, void, not self, as a danger, as subject to change, as having no core, as the root of calamity, as murderous, as due to be annihilated, as subject to cankers, as formed, as Mara's bait, as subject to birth, as subject to aging, as subject to illness, as subject to death, as subject to sorrow, as subject to lamentation, as subject to despair, as subject to defilement. In the formula for the First Noble Truth, as I said, it starts with recognizing birth, sickness, old age, and death. And it concludes as saying, in short, these 5 aggregates, when clung to, are suffering. So this is a way in which we create our own suffering, and it's entirely self-generated, and it's really entirely optional, and there's no reason why we have to let ourselves suffer because of mental formations and feelings. Ask yourself in this list of attributes of the aggregates. It talks about them as being without a core, as empty, as vain. Ask yourself, how much does a feeling weigh? What shape is it? What color is it? is without substance. So how foolish it is if we allow ourselves to suffer from something that's without substance, without core, that's utterly empty and void. And the mental formation of thought forms are in many ways no better. Thought, of course, is an essential part of our being. We need to be able to think clearly to get anything done. But very often we can delude ourselves with our thought formations. And thought often works like a lawyer in court. A good lawyer can argue either side of the case, depending who's paying the bill, and make it sound convincing. And often we can justify our bad actions or our bad emotional states, but justifying them with seeming reasonable, rational justifications. But that comes in after the fact. And I think it's a general rule for most people most of the time that you make decisions intuitively or emotionally and then justify them after the fact with logical arguments. I remember one of the things Kama said was the best way to make a hard decision is to flip a coin. And he said it's not because the coin has any magic power. It doesn't. It's just that when the coin's in the air, you'll suddenly know what you really want. And if you can find this attitude of clear seeing and detachment and non-ownership, non-identification with the aggregates, then this is a taste of freedom. When the suttas talk about the goal of the path, in English we often say enlightenment, which is curious. I don't know how that really got stuck as the English word, because it doesn't really correspond well with anything in the Pali. It's most often, I think, called vimutti, which means freedom, liberation. It literally means the breaking of chains. And in a mundane sense, it was the word used if, like, when a slave gained his freedom, he was vimuchati. It's the verb, and vimutti is the participle. As a liberated person has been vimutti. Another word that's used is bodhi, meaning awakened, woken up. And an arahant, one of the things said about an arahant is he's laid down the burden. So these aggregates are seen as a burden. And they're forms of manifestation. They're conditionally arisen. And seeing the aggregates in this way is this kind of this list, sounds like a harsh attitude towards the aggregates, but seeing them in that way is seeing them as the outflow or the manifestation of samsaric becoming, of conditionality. And anything that's conditioned, which means anything that's manifest as a form, has aggregates, is imperfect. It's broken from day one. It's like a flaw in the universal, unfettered potential of voidness. Once something becomes manifest, it's like a little broken shard, and it's already beginning to head towards dissolution. As soon as anything comes into being, it's heading towards decay and dissolution. And if we identify and take ownership and place importance and significance on these broken fragments of existence, then we're inevitably going to suffer. We're going to experience suffering. So to kind of bring it back and conclude with the practical application of this is, first of all, don't take your mental states so seriously. They're really not important. And secondly, don't blame your mental states on external circumstances or other people. You're responsible for your own inner life. And thirdly, remember the little mantra of not me, not mine, which is something you can use to remind yourself when you find yourself caught up and forgetful.